Hello and welcome to the ManageIQ Sprint 180 review. This was a regular 2-week sprint that we were supposed to have 2 weeks ago, but due to circumstances, we're having it today. So as usual, I will provide the overview. Kavya will update us on the UI, Adam on the providers, and Jason on the rest. So this sprint, as you can see, there was a big change upwards in number of pull requests merged as well as opened. Primarily that is due to us switching from Travis to GitHub Actions. That caused a lot of pull requests to be created. And you can actually see that here in this next slide, which shows that, in terms of bugs and enhancements, we were in line with previous sprints, but the tests and the other stuff, that kind of took up most of the pull request space. With that, I will turn it over to Kavya.
Thanks, Oleg. This sprint total 39 PRs got merged in across UI repos, 7 bugs, 6 enhancements, and so on. So I kept only important ones in slides. Next one, please. This is a small bug. Whenever there is no data in dashboard charts, we were just displaying empty chart with no text, so it feels like broken chart. So I added an empty label here so that it seems like an empty chart. Next one. This is a bug fixed by Harpreet long time ago, and I finally reviewed it. In provision screen, volumes tab wasn't retaining data when we switched tabs, so fix that issue here. Just like previous one, in volumes tab, checkbox value is not saving at all when we switch tabs, so fix that issue here. In Morphe version, whenever we click on edit storage form from summary page, it was broken. AutoST team fixed that issue here. And this is only happens in Morphe, so fixed in Morphe. AutoST team added this enhancement, added volume mapping details in host initiator summary and vice versa. Next one. Gilbert converted VM and templates edit form to React and Carbon in this PR. Next one. Jeffrey converted catalog items resource table to React and Carbon from plain HTML as part of converting all tables to Carbon. I did fix few white source security issues in these PRs. Yeah, that's all. I think that's all from UI. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Kavya. For AutoSTE Sprint, the team improved the way that host initiator groups are being displayed on the UI. They made changes to display the type of host initiator group, whether it's a cluster type or a single host, and then what it is connected to. For IBM Cloud, they added additional events that we're catching and parsing as part of targeted refresh. So now in addition to VMs, we're also targeting images, networks, and volume events. They also added improved snapshot support. So we now have operations to create, delete, revert snapshots, as well as collect the size of the snapshots as part of inventory refresh, so you can see how large the different snapshots are for Power BS. They also improved the Terraform test automation so that we can reliably reproduce the spec environment when we re-record VCR specs. Next slide. For Power HMC, the team is now collecting what HMC calls shared storage pools. These are mapped to the storages model in ManageIQ. They also fixed templates not being properly subclassed under the Power HMC namespace and extended and improved the spec test coverage for that provider. For Power VC, they fixed an image import credential validation issue. The credentials were not being checked when we were doing the normal scheduled verify credentials check. So now they're being checked as well. Next slide. A bunch of fixes on KubeVirt. We got some questions about whether this was still supported enabled. So I went and did a quick double check and found a number of issues related to just from being stale, not looked at for a long time when the rest of the code base changed. The KubeVirt authentication check was always failing, even if the credentials were valid. So we fixed that up. There was also an issue with the templates API. in FogKubeVirt, it was only working with the OpenShift version 3 style, which was /OAPI, as opposed to OpenShift 4, which has API groups. So I fixed that up. So now you can use the KubeVirt provider with OpenShift v4. I also fixed issues with the KubeVirt refresh and added a full spec test coverage. There were specs that were testing specific parsers, but nothing that did an end-to-end VCR collect, parse, and persist test. So now we're doing that as well. So hopefully we could catch those types of failures in the future. For OpenStack, we're fixed a number of issues with cloud volumes. The minimum size was set to 0, and if you pick 0, it would fail on the OpenStack side. So now the minimum size is 1 byte, I believe. Also fixed issues with the cloud volume edit dialogues that were kind of fallout from the cloud volume create and edit support from AutoSTE. The rest of the API changed how we're getting the edit dialogues. So we fixed those as well as the create dialogues. Essentially, before, the same params for create were being used for both create and edit. And after that change on the API, the two are split. And so that change never made it to OpenStack, but now it is. We also fixed an issue with symbolized keys. Basically, when DDF parameters pass params down to the operation, they're all in strings, and we are expecting them in symbols in the operation. And so we're converting those over. Next slide. For Oracle Cloud, one of the recent changes they have changes what the identity service URL is, and that was causing us failures on the VCR tests. The old URL is still available, but the gem by default will use the newer one, and that was causing our VCRs to mismatch on that. And for VMware, we're now queuing the remote console ticket acquire operation for the VMware operations worker. Before, this was going to just the nil queue, so a generic worker was processing it, which was causing the connection to build the cache, and end result was that opening remote consoles was timing out because it was taking way longer to do that operation than it should have normally. So we're now queuing that for the operations worker, which has the cache already pre-built. And I believe that's it for providers. Next slide.
Okay, on the platform side, a change was made to add supports create for configuration scripts, which should open up, which uses the supports feature mixin that we have. The ability was added to get the container orchestrators pod. This allows the code to know when it's running in the orchestrator and be able to interact with itself. An addition was made to tell the Postgres client to use the OS cert bundle. This changes the way SSL works for Postgres. And some changes were made to support S390X as a possible build target. We don't build S390X upstream, but this allows it to build on S390X. Also, Joe and Keenan and a number of others have been working on Rails 6.1 and Ruby 3 support. So there's just a handful of issues listed there, but there's many more. Many gems were updated to allow for Rails 6.1 and including ManageIQ schema. And then Joe made some changes to get rid of the appraisal gem that we used in favor of a much simpler approach for testing multiple versions of Rails. And that testing then was added to those gems so that we can test on multiple versions at the same time. And then a big change was made to active record virtual attributes to move it to Rails 6.1. And we've also changed the way we release that gem so that it aligns with Rails directly, and then we don't have to support multiple versions of Rails at the same time because it's really complicated to do so. Next slide, please. Some bugs that were fixed. Skip other validation checks when checking the host name. I honestly don't remember the details of this one, but pretty sure we skipped validation checks when we're checking the host name. Brandon fixed an issue where the deployment on Podified would say it was new deployment, meaning that it wouldn't allow you to install further. And this would happen if it failed after it created the database, but before it seeded the database. And technically in that case, we can still move on and just say skip creating the database and move on to seeding. So this allows that to move through in that weird edge case. And Keenan also made a fix to MIQ expression field target to make it consistent with get call info. This is more of an inside thing about MIQ expression, but depending on which way you used it, you'd get two different MIQ expressions, like the content would be different. And this makes them more consistent so that future changes can build on top of that. And then on the documentation side, there was a lot of documentation added. A new section was added for Kubernetes new installations, how to install using Kubernetes on Kubernetes using the operator. Some documentation about the OS certificate bundle that I mentioned earlier. Adam added changes for adding documentation for adding a new KubeVirt provider, excuse me. And I think Vincent added changes for adding a new Power HMC provider. And finally, Adam fixed an issue in the documentation where the left side nav was broken for the containers providers section. On the API side, Keenan added a change to add RBAC around the EMS lookup. So there was a bunch of changes where you would look up the management system and we weren't really checking RBAC. Things wouldn't have worked later, so it's not really an exposure. But the worst case scenarios, you would know that an EMS ID might exist. But this adds that RBAC earlier so that you just get a 400 error early on. And Gilbert fixed an issue with templates and VMs. The templates API didn't have anything about genealogy in it, whereas the VMs API did. But you can do the same genealogy operations on both. So he fixed it so they shared the code, and now you can do genealogy operations on both. And finally, Keenan did a huge refactoring to consolidate the create methods across the entire API, simplifying the code a lot. On the developer side, we finished replacing Hakiri with white source. This is one of the things that contributed to that huge spike in the graph. White source will checks for dependency CVEs. Similar to Dependabot, but it comes up with different answers. So we're going to use both. That has been done across the entire org, so that's done. We also continued switching to GitHub Actions, so 7 repositories in this particular sprint. And the big change was that Oleg changed the ManageIQ build status repo to now show the GitHub Actions and kind of revamped it and made it look a lot nicer. So if you need an at-a-glance view of the CI state of any ManageIQ repo, you can just go to this one repo and they're all there at once. Joe added a change to announce the cross repo run information. When we run cross repo, this just prints out the information that it knows. It's mostly useful for local development, but also when you run your build, you can verify that it's actually doing the right thing because you can see it. And finally, I added a change to allow updating gems before locking. This is part of the release process. And it makes it simpler when a new gem is bumped in a release that we can just say, update the lock file of just this one gem. And that's it.
All right. Thank you very much. And we'll see you again at the next sprint review. And with that, I'd like to thank all the contributors, the community, and the speakers for a great sprint review. Thank you so much. Yeah.